So today I'm going to be talking about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and its effect on CEO compensation. And this is joint work with Chen Li, who is at NYU Shanghai, and Bob Miller from Carnegie Mellon. So Sarbanes-Oxley, normally people call it SOX, is a legislative response to the corporate failures of the 2000s, right? So, it was one of the most extensive regulation in the security markets up to then, since the 1930s here. And what it did was that it is a significant inroad in the government in the governance of firms, publicly traded firms in the United States. Right? So what we're going to try to do today is ask the following questions: is what happened to our labor market when the government replaced some form of what I would say incentive contract or some form of incentives with regulations that is going to affect these different things. So what's going to happen is that we're going to look at a market in which we have frictions and see what happened when the government intervened. Right? So it changed compensation in a bunch of possible ways, and there's a lot of, I would say, descriptive evidence and case studies that show that it could possibly change the compensation through enhancing the independence of the board. Right. So, in another paper that I have with Bob Miller, we're looking at interlock, for example. Interlock is when you have a CEO which is on the board of another CEO who is on the compensation committee of that CEO, right? So basically, your friend is your boss is paying you, okay? And that was kind of outlawed basically by SOX. Okay, so if you look at the data, you'll see this big drop in interlock executive here. So independence of the board is going to be enhanced, and internal controls are going to be enhanced. Go ahead.
So why don't firms do this themselves?
We're gonna look at that because that's going to be one of the diffs and diffs that I'm actually going to do in terms of firms that were compliant as my control group. Of course, they're compliant for a reason, right? And then I'm going to compare them to firms that were not compliant and why they basically do that. We're going to show that there is no free lunch, right? There is no free lunch in the sense that although it pushed things one way, it actually increased the cost in some other ways, right? And this was what you would expect when you intervene, when you're playing around with the second best. Right? You're not at the first best. When you're playing around the second best, when you push and pull different things, you get these different responses. And what I'm going to show, especially with the compliant versus the non-compliant group, is that we are going to have a way to, I'm going to call it semi-parametrically identify the parameters, and so we're not going to be imposing that they're up there, they're doing anything, and then we're going to see how it changes. So that's why, Bob resists this name, but I like to call it a structural definitive, right? In the sense that we're going to say, okay, if people were doing this before, then they must have found it optimal given the contract that they were going to set to do it. Okay, the contract is second best. From that contract, I'm going to then back out what are the primitives. And then I'm going to calculate a bunch of measures which you can't actually calculate without a structural model. And then I'm going to compare them across the before and after and do the standard definitive 4x4 type of analysis that you're going to have here. So one of the things that is going to be important, however, is disclosure quality. And the model need to, this is something we struggle with initially, and find a way to do it. But we'll need to figure out why is it that we have this disclosure. One of the problems we have with this disclosure is, apart from like interlock, where you basically think about, okay, I'm basically my own boss because by extension I'm my friend, right? Just imagine my network is paying me. The other problem we have is that we want to have a moral hazard problem, let's say. Right? And that's to solve that moral hazard problem, we need to basically use a signal, right, of performance. And that signal of performance we are going to base our pay upon. However, what happens, like in Enron case, when the manager that you're paying control the information upon which that signal is based? So then what we're going to do is that we're going to write a model that is not just a moral hazard model, but a model with moral hazard and private information. So hidden action and hidden information. And you have to figure out a way now what would be the optimal contract. So you could go, it's one of those models that is buried deep in Mascalel. It's called a hybrid model, right? Oh no, just eat it. All right, sorry, right? and so this it affects disclosure because what Sarbanes-Oxley did was that it changed the incentive for reporting that wrongly. Right. So before you report it, the CEO doesn't have to certify it or anything. And what SOX did was that the incentive to report truthfully now become a legal liability. You have to literally certify it under penalty of prison. Okay? That to the best of your knowledge, these are the true reports. So you could think of a way in which, going back to Peter's question, in that there was an incentive compatible contract that basically gets you to report truthfully by giving you the right incentive before SOX. And now that part is going to be taken away, at least highly mitigated, in terms of that by or replaced by government things here. So what we're going to see is that CEO could deviate from the shareholders' interest or the productive action, and that could be seen more costly, or they be hesitant to reveal good news. So a lot of people complain, CEOs complain, they read the literature, they're saying, yeah, I don't, now I have to sign this thing that everything I said is true, right? Well, what happened is that there are this great information that I know, and I could tell it to the shareholders, but I don't want to do it anymore because if I do it and it turns out to be not so good, then I can go to prison. Right? How does that hesitancy change the optimal contract here? How does that change the optimal contract here? And does it change the choice of effort? Right? Does it change what is implemented through this compensation after these different things here? So as I said before, it's a very, very, very simple paper in the sense is that you have a market in which you have two types of market friction, right? Hidden action and hidden information. Prior to the government intervention, there was a contract that was signed between the firm and the managers, and that we are going to assume was profit maximizing in some way, given the information structure that was there. The government intervened and it replaced some of those elements that were in that contract with now some legal provisions. What happens, right? That's basically what we are basically going to do here. So the problem here is that going through the literature, there's a lot of descriptive literature. There's a volume of descriptive literature, but not any that takes the model seriously and look at what are the evaluation of efficiency grounds, right? So we some of them we are going to borrow from of that literature in terms of the descriptive what goes on. But what we are going to bring to this is that we are going to bring a evaluation of efficiency here.
So one thing maybe is coming up with lots of people chatting about this is it change the incident to go public and to go private. Are you going to worry about that? That actually part of what's been going on in this period of time is the U.S. has become more private?
Yes, I'm going to worry about that, and I'm going to solve that based on the selection of the sample, as opposed to I'm not going to model the incentive to go private.
You probably can't do efficiency without.
So maybe I should be very careful about efficiency. So efficiency is not aggregate efficiency, right? I'm going to think about the trade-off within the optimal contract for those firms. So I'm going to think about in terms of how close I get to this first best solving that individual contract. No, so it's not going to tell. It doesn't tell you anything about the aggregate efficiency of the economy, right? It's like given this contract, we have a second best component, and we normally think of in the principal agent, we can think about efficiency as how close I get to the second best contract here, and what are the costs of getting there. So that's what we are going to evaluate here, not aggregate efficiency. Right. Okay, so this is the world I'm going to be thinking of. Right, I'm thinking of a world in which there is an optimal contract that is normally signed between the CEO and the shareholders, right? What is it doing? Why do we even have an optimal contract? An optimal contract is because we are going to assume that there are going to be some misalignment, right? Some misalignment between the objective of the CEO and the objective of the shareholders. Now, I used to call this shirking versus working, but I used to get a lot of pushback, and I think we were chatting up. Miriam Bertrand and I was talking once about this, and it's like, no, it's not really. When we talk about working versus shirking, it's not that. There's a nice paper by Miriam Bertrand and some co-authors. We said, what does CEOs who don't have good governance structure do, right? And the answer was enjoy the quiet life, right? Is that they give workers are paid more, right? They go there's a lot more retreat, a lot more perks, a lot more these different things, and these things may not be maximizing shareholder value, right? So we're just saying that there is a discrepancy between what the shareholder would do if he could monitor the CEO and see, all right, and what the CEO would do given that his activities cannot be perfectly monitored by the manager. So this is going to be the misalignment of interest that we're going to try to quantify here. And over here, it has some costs, right? It doesn't come out free. So to the shareholders, there's some costs. And I'm going to think of the world, the model I'm going to write down that is going to be able to identify a few things. One is think of a frictionless benchmark, right? So think of a frictionless benchmark and think about how much you would have to pay the CEO to put the effort that would be maximizing the shareholders' interest relative to his outside option, right? So the framework I'm going to do is going to be able to identify this. I'm going to call it administrative costs, and it's really not administrative costs. It's just that one of my the co-author is an accountant and needed this to get tenure. And so we write it as administrative cost, but it's not administrative cost. From an economics point of view, what we think about this is actually the frictionless benchmark of wages, right? Right. And then we're going to have this agency cost. And this agency cost is how much you have to then pay the CEO over this frictionless benchmark for a bunch of things. One, to align interest for the shareholders. So that's the moral hazard component. Two, right, to get him to reveal truthfully his private information. Right? And three, because the contract that does that induce the CEO taking on some risk, you have to compensate him because he's risk averse. Right? So those three additional costs that he's going to have here. And so these are the things that you think about the cost to the shareholders. What does the shareholder gain from that? Well, the shareholder gain the difference between the excess return under the CEO working, right, in his own interest versus the CEO shirking, I call it shirking, but working in the CEO's best interest, right? And that's going to be optimal. We're going to try to figure out the shareholder loss here. And then we have the CEO also benefit from shirking. How much does the CEO enjoy or value the quiet life, right? Now, so these are the components that we basically going to have. Now, how does SOX potentially affect these particular components? So better governance may reduce the room for the CEO to do self-interest behavior. Okay? So this misalignment between the CEO's interest and the shareholders' interest may actually shrink. Right? So people talk about that. If you listen and you read the context of the debate and the law, that's what they're kind of saying that they want to do in some ways. So that's one thing. This next thing is that this utility from effort may change, however. So if you think about, um, you know, the CEO that is squealing, so to speak. In Jamaica, we have a thing that whenever, if you throw a stone in a pig pen, the one that squeals is the one that got hurt, right? So, the CEOs complain, right? They're like, this makes our life harder, right? Being a CEO now just become harder to work. All of this, I have all of this things I have to do, this compliance stuff, all of these different things. It just make it harder. So you think that the private benefit may become less attractive. Maybe that's why they're crying out here. And the internal control may distract the CEO from what he thinks are value-added activities, and that may be true, right? If you ever talk to any chairman of the department of economics, they would tell you that, I have to deal with all these deans and they have all of these stuff, and it's like, it just distracted me from the things that's going to make my faculty productive. Right? So it could be that it affects this component here. Or the CEO may become even more conservative, and this is something that people have been saying in the finance literature, and they may select projects that has a higher expected return, but don't have as much variance there. Right? This is the problem. None of these are observing the data. Right? That's the problem I have. Right? None of them are observing the data. And so what we're going to do is that we're going to write on a model, and we are going to interpret the data through the lens of the model to see what we can non-parametric or semi-parametric identify in terms of these three components. And then we are going to look at the impact of SOX on that. Right?
Is there reason to think that the market for CEOs is going to change? Like going back to the questions of why we did this in the first place.
Yes.
Because we want to acquire
CEO. So I don't know what went wrong. Sorry. Go ahead. Yes. So you're basically saying that this utility from effort. So what I'm going to point. I'm going to point it. You notice I have this thing here, and I said the wages that is paid for doing the right thing. I can only identify the ratio of how this utility from working in the firm versus the outside option, which is the market, right? So in that way, I'll be able to capture if that's happening. I will not be able to tell you how much of it is because it is less CEOs' jobs become more difficult, or because they're outside option, or they change their outside option there. But I'll capture that in this cost here. Again, it's not observed because that's the price that clears the non-friction market here. So yes, it will happen there too. And I do have it here. I just can't separate the two because in identification, I'm just going to basically have the ratio of those that I'm going to be able to identify. Okay, so. Again, I say require internal. We're going to require internally consistent framework to accommodate all of these factors. So that's going to be my research design here. And secondly, I want these things here. There is no ready-to-use measures that basically I can use. So I'm going to come up within the context of this framework measure for that. So even when I assume that the data generation is in equilibrium, the data doesn't give me those components here. So I kind of tell you what I'm basically going to do here. I'm going to look at in terms of alignment of interest and how it's embedded in these costs, and I'm going to say by how much it changes. I will not tell you why it changed because some of the things that we talk about with the interlock and stuff like that, that requires a dynamic model, which I will not I'll have a dynamic model here, but not with movement and promotion and turnover. We have it in a different paper that we're looking at that may have something to say with that here. So I'm going to basically then write down this framework. I'm going to quantify the effect using a non-parametric estimation. First, we talk about functional form, assumption, and distribution, and performance here. And the reason why I don't want to do that is because your question is very important. It says that it's not just that the market for CEO would change, but investors would now interpret the signal, could interpret the signal differently, right? So the distribution of excess return or return over and above what the price in the market could possibly change. So I'm going to allow that to be non-parametric. The second thing is that I'm only going to use, because of the non-parametric component, the conditions on the market for optimal contract. That means that the managers or the firm would not sign a manager to manage a firm if signing a manager to actually just shirk would be better off, right? So it's kind of a revealed preference argument, right? So basically, I'm going to use the revealed preference argument here. And those revealed preferences are a little bit more complicated because they're going to have these incentive compatibility constraints that are going to be embedded. That is not only that the CEO would not be hired to shirk versus work, has to be optimal from the point of view of the firm, are better off. It also means that once we see a compensation contract that is not a fixed wage, then it means that some incentive compatibility condition must be satisfied, right? And then once we see differences between the reported accounting numbers, right? That's how they're going to report his private information. Then it must be that some truth-telling constraint must be satisfied, right? And those are the constraints I'm going to write down, and those are all I'm going to do. And because that's all I'm going to do, these inequalities are going to show me that certain things are going to be set identified and certain things are going to be point identified. Here I'm going to exploit that. And then I'm going to have a this in this structural estimation, and that is going to be, as I explained to Peter earlier, I'm going to look at the guys who were compliant before. All right, what happened to their behavior after SOX and before SOX, and the people who were not compliant before, what happened between SOX and so forth. And the beautiful thing about this structural this and this is that I don't need parallel trend for identification, because I'm recovering the primitives in both scenarios. So I can basically do it, and I don't need the parallel trend assumption for these to be average treatment effects and these parameters that I'm going to be doing here. I never finish this paper, so let me just tell you what it's going to be, right? What the results is going to be before anything else happens. What we're going to find is the following thing. If you put these in these numbers, if you look at the cost to the CEO, we're going to find that it did reduce for most types of firm the loss incurred from incentivizing the CEO, right? So it's an average between 1 and 16% of the firm value, or about $18 billion, right? In terms of those things. And it did reduce the benefit from the CEO shirking, right? So on these sides, you have these different things. On the other hand, it did increase primarily in the primary sector where we did not have a lot of compliance before, right? It did increase what I call administrative costs, right? This, as I said before, could be either because it's become harder to attract managers to do that, or because the job becomes so onerous that they don't want to do it given the liability that is implied, and then so you have to pay them more, right? So this is kind of the unintended consequence here. In the service sector, however, where we see a lot of compliance beforehand, right? That means they had found it optimal to do it here. There is very little change really here, but in some particular sectors you're going to find that here. And here's the kicker: is the following thing is that while it reduces this, it increases the agency costs. And it's basically a law of physics, I guess, right? Is that what it reduced the scope for using incentives to incentivize the manager, right? So in order to get the same effort out of the manager, or to get the incentive compatibility constraint to be satisfied with less tools at your availability or less effectiveness for some tools, you have to load him up on a lot more contingent compensation. He's risk averse, right? He still has to be indifferent between his outside option and working for the firm. To maintain those two conditions, you have to pay him more. Yeah. To maintain those two conditions, you have to pay more. So if you take, and this is what I mean by efficiency, I should never use the word efficiency, right? Is that if you take these costs over here versus the benefits over here, the intervention of the government was not cost improving. But maybe that's the reason what Peter was getting at, right? Is that maybe it is the case that it was not optimal in the first place to do this for some of the firms. That's why they didn't do it again. And we're going to show that this argument holds on the average, but it is much more pronounced on the non-compliant firm. And the firms that were compliant, basically don't see most of this.
But I mean, I don't know, like that last statement you made, how does that add up? I was looking at you find a reduction in the cost of shirking of like around 10% of a market cap of 80
Yes.
billion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not able to pay for the increase in the three other costs that you have in these bubbles that are in the billions. It seems like I'm misunderstanding something.
Oh yeah, so you see, this is about market cap, right? So in order to do this, I need to multiply it by the value of the firm and take the discounted value of future compensation over his value here. So yeah, so these are not the unit of measurements are not necessarily the same, right? And maybe the better thing we should do is put it in the same unit of measurement, but they're not the same. That is in the same unit of measurement here.
Because one is a flow and the other is a stock.
As a stock, yeah, right. One is a flow, and the other is a stock. All right. And I said this before, so let me get to the data. Right? I said that before. Let me get to the data. All right. So the main data source, and I have 20 minutes to do this. I can do it. The main data source is going to be the executive compensation, CRISP, CompuStat, and risk matrix, right? And the risk matrix is basically going to be used to see firms that were compliant with the different rules of Sarbanes-Oxley or not. We're going to break things down into three industries: primary, consumer, and service. We're going to have two levels of firm size, right? Large or small, based on these different things. And we are going to also have a capital structure, which has to do with the debt to equity ratio, and we're going to have that large or small. And we're doing this because of the non-parametric nature of it. We actually could have done this with more continuous measures, and we have done that in our AR paper with more continuous measures, but then you have to be parametric. And for this exercise, we did not want to do parametric because of the possibility of the change here. Performance measures is going.
How did you determine the 1,500 firms? This is firms move in and out?
Yeah.
Is it a balanced panel or unbalanced panel?
Unbalanced balance. It's going to be, so it has to be balanced before and after SOX, right? So, but before SOX, some firms I have for up to from 93 up, and some firms I have for at least 5 years up, right? So the pre-period is not balanced. The post-period is balanced. And it is the 1,500 firms is not 1,500 firms. There are actually 2,500 firms. Because of it, you're talking about firms come in and out over the data sample and so forth. So it is the S&P 1500. At some point, you were in the S&P 1500, right? And my pre-period is going to have from 93 up to 2000, or from 97 up to 95 up to 2000. Yeah. You have a question? Oh, sorry. I think I saw it. Okay. All right. Oh, so we're gonna get the proxy. They normally use in this literature the abnormal return. This is before paying compensation. We're going to also have proxies of private information, which is going to be the whole idea in the accounting literature that accounting numbers are not real numbers. They're actually just reports. And we're going to do this relative to the reports of your particular benchmark, your firm size comparison group that we're going to do here. And then we're going to do the optimal compensation, which is basically just a kernel regression of total compensation, which is calculated as a present discounted value of all the flows, right, on the abnormal return and the binary returns here. There's some institutional detail. So from which matrix here, I'm going to classify firms before into what I would normally call a control group and a treatment group, right? But it's just whether compliant versus not compliant. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the legislation, and I'm basically going to look at the matrix for majority of the board is independent that was put forward in SOC. The entire audit committee was independent, right? The entire compensation committee is independent. Those are all regulations that SOX put in. And then I'm going to go to its matrix. I'm going to classify the firms that were compliant, that had that already, and the firms that did not do that here. Right. Here's some of some simple regression. So this is basically the probability density of the excess return here, right? And this is pre-SOX, and this is post-SOX. Right? So I have some non-parametric tests here, but I think my eyeball test would tell me that there was a change in the excess return after that.
One question on getting this independence of the board, because it would seem if I'm on two boards and I have to give up one of them, it could be to the benefit of the firm if I gave up the other one.
Yeah.
How do we think about
which one I give up?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have it's on a paper, but not that in this one. But you in that one, we basically model the board of directors as also just being agents that are being paid because they're being paid, right? And they're going to take into consideration in that paper their career option too. So they're going to think about, if I'm on this board, I may get more visibility and think about my career and move off. A lot of people move off the board, they get some executive position, move back, and so forth. And then I'm going to select the one that maximizes my future expected value, right? Right. And so in the paper with Limor, we actually have that written down, written in terms of how do you select between the different boards and how SOX changed that. Because before, you could choose 3 boards maybe, right? And maybe that combination of board maybe what gives you the best possibility of future. They're paid money too, so it's not just there is instantaneous value of getting more money, but there are also career values of my networking and what we can end up in the future, right? And SOX changed that, right?
Yeah, I guess you just had in mind that I benefit from the other firms being restricted.
So you're thinking about competition relative to but then I have to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
Right? I would, if unless I have some intrinsic reason why I'm just great, right? I'm just great, and everybody wants to be on my board. Then, if that's the case, it could have some, inequality may increase, right? In terms of the better firms get things. But if they're similar people competing, then there's gonna be a bidding war basically. And so one thing is saying,
Panel A would sort of say that that's not the case.
the-
They're just great because then you get a fund.
panel A says this is post SOX, right? And what panel A says is that the probability of having high return is lower,
Yeah.
right? So there are there are these great these great benefits that could possibly come from up there, and it could be impounded because of you know yeah, I don't know how to interpret that actually. I don't know if my panel A is saying that. Right? My panel A is definitely saying that it's more concentrated. That means there is not as much outliers as before. All right? But I'm not sure whether it would mean that I haven't been away for the guy. Because one benefit of having that guy is that he's going to concentrate on me alone.
Yeah.
And that may make make my company do better. And maybe my company is out here. No. No, I see what you're saying. So this would say that would not be the case. That's what you're saying here. Yeah. All right. And so here are the compensation contracts before and after SOX. Good. This is the when he reports bad. This I'm sorry. This is bad or good. Make sure. So this is good is red, which that's not good to have red as good, but good is red. And when you say that the prospect is good, what you see is a steeper compensation schedule. When you say that the prospect is bad, you see a flatter compensation schedule, meaning more insurance in the compensation schedule here. And this is basically needed to get truth telling to hold. And what you can see, however, is that over here in post SOX, this gets steeper. And this has this weird kinky shape, right? This S shape. Right? And so one of the things is that just from this, you can see, I can rationalize now because I kind of been working with these models forever, is that you can kind of see what's going on, is that over here, this is having more incentive to tell the truth because there's a separation between the bad state and the good state is bigger. Over here in a big part of the range, it's not. And at some point up here, it's like, okay, it's just basically flat because of it is not worth it to pay the guy to reveal things up here because the likelihood has gone down so significantly. And that was the non-parametric test. All these non-parametric tests is just saying that everything here is different, right? Statistically different. The functions are different, right? The functions are different here. So here's my model in 10 minutes, because I'm going to do my model. The model is quite simple. Shareholders are paid a compensation contract, post a compensation contract that has a schedule of W, and W depends on R and X, which is basically a schedule. And if you report R, it could be good or bad. Here's what the schedule is in terms of X. And if you report bad, you have a different things, right? CEOs can either accept or reject the contract. If they accept the contract, then there are two market frictions. The first one is hidden information. The CEO privately observe the prospect of the firm, and he has to report this prospect R. Now there's a true prospect, and then there's R, which is report. So there's a possibility of lying here. Right? There's hidden action. He can either work in the shareholder's interest, or he can enjoy the quiet life. Right? And the performance measure comes from the market, but the market uses R to update its belief about the future streams of dividends that the CEO is going to place. And this is going to be a long-term contract, but given some specification in terms of absolute risk aversion, and the independent of the distributions across time, it decentralizes into a series of short-term contracts. So that's the basic things here. And just think about the following thing. We normalize everything here outside to be negative. So this is the absolute risk aversion thing. Here, rejects it, you get -1. You accept it, you get this alpha 2. And alpha 2 is really the ratio of working in the firm versus the outside option. And then you have this value that you get in terms of your compensation, and it's integrated over the true distribution here. If you shirk, however, the difference here is that you have this G, which is a likelihood ratio, and that G multiplies this. So the distribution from which X is drawn is now not going to be F, but it's going to be F times G here. And we have the standard thing is that there is only an incentive problem if alpha 1 is less than alpha 2. And it has to be that this here in some way stochastically dominates this. Right? It doesn't have to be the monotone likelihood ratio increasing, but it has to be some amount of increasing in the likelihood ratio here. CEOs are going to have access to a contingent band that is going to allow them to smooth all the wealth held outside the firm in a market index, basically, right? And we can write down the contingency claim contract that goes back to 2000, and then you can show that actually comes down, that everything is summarized into the price of this contingent band price that we're going to have here, right? Contingent band price here. So what you solve the optimal contract, you basically just solving the expected return condition and are working subject to these incentive compatible constraint, which is I must prefer working versus the outside. I must prefer honesty versus shirking, and working and honesty versus shirking and honesty. And I must prefer working honesty over working and lying. And then I must also prefer working honesty over shirking and underreporting here. Right? And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to put this to my model. And the basic idea just goes the following way. I'm just going to assume that whatever is the model is going to generate the data. Right? So what am I allowing for? Aggregate shocks in the constructing. I'm going to have the primitives going to be explicitly different between the periods and the different possible groups. And I'm going to capture the major agency costs here. And what I'm backing out, what I have to back out things from, everything has to come from this. This is all I have, right? I mean, there's multiple of these because I have different types, but this is one example. So it's basically mapping directly onto these things here. That's all that you have. So it's similar to what Peter was doing in the sense that this, you have these hazard rates, or in this case, these schedules, and you're going to back out the things from the differences that we see there. Right, so that's all we're going to do. So we can prove the uniqueness. We're going to construct some specification tests, and we're going to build a criteria function that's basically going to do the following thing. So we can show that there is mapping. If you give me gamma, right, give me the risk aversion parameter, there's a one-to-one mapping between the underlying distribution function and the schedule to the alpha j's. You give me gamma, and there's a one-to-one mapping between the distribution function, the wages, and the shirking component. And the intuition here is thus that the curvature of the schedule, right, maps directly into the risk, given the risk aversion, map directly into the likelihood ratio, right? So that's the basic thing. We can set up our criteria function here, and then it's set identify, and then I'm just going to use subsampling to estimate the things here. So the first test. A lot of the literature in finance and accounting have interpreted this here to say that the CEOs are more risk averse. Okay. Now, one of the things for people who have done structural estimation or model-based inference is that we know that that could just be a selection problem. Right? And so one thing that once we have the identification, we can back out the risk aversion parameters that rationalize the two periods. And we can test it because we have these over-identifying tests here. And the beautiful thing about this set identification is that the intuition for tests is basically whether or not the estimated set confidence interval overlaps or not, right? And the 95% confidence interval for risk aversion is almost, not almost, but it has a significant overlap. So you cannot reject that the risk preference or risk behavior did not change. You cannot reject that the risk behavior did not change here. So this is the risk aversion parameters that we estimate for the different periods, and these are the certainty equivalent of a gamble that gives you 0 if with 50% chance, or $500,000 with 50% chance, right? So given the numbers in the literature, these CEOs are not that risk averse, but they're also not risk neutral either, right? So they're not that risk averse and they're not risk neutral over here. So here's the overview of what we talked about a little before, the diligent periods, the differences. I think I said this in words, I don't need that anymore. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the alignment of interest here, the alignment of the interest here. So the return while the CEO working versus shirk. And so you can see that this reduced more in the non-compliant firm, right? It reduced more in the non-compliant firms here. And this is what I was talking about, the alignment of the interest here. And it's again reviewed more in firms with large values before SOX, right? So the ones that have, if I was doing a intent to treat type of intensity, diffs and diff, this is what you would expect, and this is what I have here. So 2 minutes, right? Yes. All right. And this is the cost, administrative cost, that I talked about before, increase in the primary sector, especially increase more in the non-compliant firms that are large in the primary sector. So that's what basically I'm going to get, and it's reduced more in the non-compliant firm that are in the primary sector here. So just a summary here is that if you look in terms of the different things, let's go to the consumer sector. Here you see what's going on here: negative, 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 negative. Everything here is going to be negative here. Some of them here, and especially the small firms, we basically have some things that, positive, positive, positive. And for the large firms here, we have negative plus negative, which gives us a positive imply here. I'm just going to wrap up. Is that the main finding that SOX improve the alignment between shareholders and the CEOs, most notably in the non-compliant firm. The administrative costs reduce more in the non-compliant firms. And what was that? All right, that fell out. And I'm assuming it just goes back here, right? All right. And the agency costs increase in this particular sense here. So I'm going to stop there. The basic idea is that intervention in a second best contract, right, while it may achieve its goal, may have unintended consequences, right? Because the idea is basically that in some way the firms that was chosen to be non-compliant to these particular rules were doing the optimal in the first place. All right, thank you.